Dr. Ezra Cole was not the kind of man you'd mistake for a hero. A decorated but reclusive xenobiologist, his contributions to humanity's understanding of alien biology had earned him respect and enemies in equal measure. Ezra was a survivor of distant expeditions, hostile creatures, and most of all, himself. When the alien ship had appeared in Earth's orbit, no one could have guessed its purpose. The strange vessel was a patchwork of shimmering metals and glowing veins, pulsing like a living organism. Communication had been impossible. Before the governments of Earth could mobilize a response, an energy beam engulfed Ezra in his secluded laboratory. He awoke in a cell, cold and unfamiliar. The walls were translucent, pulsating with faint cyan light. Ezra's analytical mind took over. Air composition? Breathable. Temperature? Stable. Gravity? Marginally higher than Earth's. His body ached from the sudden transition, but he pushed past the discomfort. He wasn't one to panic. Panic was the quickest way to get killed. Ezra's body, thus far, had been the most damaged and benefited from the proper physical activity. But every movement, life energy for the ravage of his exercises had been destroying his skin coloring. The walls were too high. The water had drawn power from the room behind him. He sat and waited. A second and seconds longer wouldn't matter. Instead, he steadily grew stronger. The creatures who had taken him were towering figures, their elongated limbs covered in iridescent carapaces. Their multifaceted eyes betrayed no emotion. They seemed to speak among themselves in clicking staccato sounds, occasionally glancing at him with what he could only describe as curiosity. They didn't strike him as cruel, but they weren't exactly a blend of insect and machine, their movements precise, almost clinical. He sat cross-legged on the floor, observing them as they observed him. He'd spent his career studying the unknown. Now, he was the subject. A grim irony, but one he could use to his advantage. Knowledge was power, and if they wanted to learn about him, he'd learn about them first. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The light in the cell shifted subtly, dimming and brightening in cycles. Ezra assumed it mimicked some form of day-night rhythm. The aliens didn't feed him or attempt any physical examinations, which only deepened the mystery. They simply watched, their insectoid faces inscrutable. When they finally spoke, it was through a synthesized voice that echoed unnaturally in the chamber. "Human specimen, you will provide us with data. Adaptation in hostile environments. Observational phase begins now." Ezra opened his mouth to respond, but before he could demand answers, the floor beneath him dissolved. He plummeted into darkness, a brief moment of weightlessness before gravity reasserted itself. He landed hard, the impact jarring his bones. Groaning, he pushed himself upright and surveyed his new surroundings. He was in an enormous cavern, lit by the eerie bioluminescent glow of fungi and strange crystalline formations. The air was thick with humidity and the faint scent of sulfur. The ground beneath him was uneven, a mix of jagged rocks and soft, spongy moss. The environment felt alien, yet strangely familiar, like a distorted version of Earth's more inhospitable terrains. Ezra's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. He scanned the area, noting potential hiding spots and escape routes. His mind raced with questions. Why had they brought him here? Was this the hostile environment they mentioned? And what exactly were they observing? The answer came sooner than he'd hoped. The first roar shattered the silence, low and guttural, vibrating through Ezra's chest. His body froze, every muscle tensed. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound. A massive shadow emerged from the depths of the cavern. It moved with a predatory grace, each step deliberate and powerful. As it stepped into the light, Ezra's breath caught in his throat. It was a dragon. Not a creature of mythology, but a living, breathing nightmare. Its scales shimmered like molten obsidian, reflecting the cavern's bioluminescent glow. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that sent a chill down Ezra's spine. Claws like scythes scraped against the rocky floor, and smoke curled from its nostrils. Ezra's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to think. Panic was death. He'd faced apex predators before, though none as imposing as this. His mind cataloged the creature's features, searching for weak points, behavior patterns, anything he could exploit. The dragon lunged. Ezra dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the beast's snapping jaws. He hit the ground and rolled, his body protesting every movement. The dragon's head swung toward him, its molten eyes locking onto its prey. It roared again, a sound that reverberated through the cavern and sent a flock of bat-like creatures scattering from the ceiling. Down to his feet. Scrambling to his feet, Ezra searched for something, anything he could use as a weapon. His hands found a shard of crystal, jagged and sharp. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. The dragon advanced, its massive body coiling like a spring. Ezra backed away, keeping his eyes on the creature. He needed a plan. The dragon was faster and stronger, but it wasn't invincible. No creature was. As the dragon lunged again, Ezra sidestepped and struck out with the crystal shard. The makeshift weapon glanced off the beast's scales, leaving only a shallow scratch. It wasn't enough to hurt it, but it was enough to make it angry. The dragon's tail whipped around, catching Ezra in the side and sending him flying. He hit the ground hard, pain lancing through his ribs. Gasping for breath, he forced himself to move. Staying still was not an option. Through the haze of pain, Ezra noticed something. The dragon hesitated before attacking, favoring its left side. An old injury, perhaps? Or a vulnerability? He filed the observation away, hoping he'd live long enough to use it. The dragon roared again, charging at him with terrifying speed. Ezra dodged, barely avoiding its claws. He needed to act fast. The creature was testing him, gauging his movements. It wouldn't give him many more chances, because the claws seemed to grow in the darkness, cleaving him from the sound of their claws. Climbing onto a nearby rock formation, Ezra gained a better vantage point. The dragon followed, its massive claws digging into the stone. As it climbed, Ezra noticed a patch of softer, paler scales near its throat. A weak spot, starting to look like a mangled pelvis. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ezra leapt onto the dragon's back. The beast thrashed, trying to shake him off, but he held on, his fingers digging into its scales. With a primal scream, he drove the crystal shard into the vulnerable spot at the base of its skull. The dragon roared in pain, its body convulsing. Ezra held on, driving the shard deeper until the creature collapsed, its massive body thudding to the cavern floor. Breathing heavily, Ezra climbed off the fallen beast. His body ached, his hands trembling from the effort, but he was alive, and the dragon was not. Above him, the translucent ceiling shimmered. He could sense the alien observers watching, their silent judgment pressing down on him. He glared up at them, his exhaustion replaced by a simmering rage. "You wanted to see a monster?" he snarled, his voice echoing through the cavern. "You got one." The cavern rumbled. From deeper within the shadows, more roars echoed, multiple. Ezra's lip curled into a grim smile. Round two, then. Ezra Cole had thought he understood the stakes. Survival, after all, was second nature to him. But as he lay on the damp cavern floor, chest heaving from the effort of felling a creature that should not have existed, he realized he'd underestimated the game his captors were playing. The dragon's lifeless body lay sprawled before him, smoke still curling from its nostrils. Its obsidian scales shimmered faintly in the bioluminescent light, a testament to its once terrifying majesty. Ezra's improvised weapon, a shard of jagged crystal, lay embedded in the beast's skull. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. He wasn't done yet, not even close. Something above him, the translucent ceiling of the cavern pulsed faintly, as if alive. Ezra had no doubt the aliens were watching, their cold, insectoid eyes fixed on their human subject. He imagined them clicking and chittering among themselves, analyzing his every move. It was infuriating. "You wanted to see what a human can do?" Ezra muttered, his voice raw. "Then watch closely." His face fell even further, his eyes closed. He forced himself to his feet, wincing as pain flared through his ribs. The dragon's tail whip had done more damage than he'd initially realized. Each breath was a struggle, but Ezra pushed through it. Pain was a distraction. He'd survived worse. The cavern was vast, its walls lined with strange crystalline formations that cast an ethereal glow. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the space. Ezra scanned his surroundings, searching for anything he could use. The crystal shard had been effective, but it was gone now, buried in the dragon's skull. He needed a new weapon, or at least a plan. His gaze fell on a nearby cluster of bioluminescent fungi. They emitted a soft, greenish light, their bulbous caps glistening with moisture. Ezra's scientific instincts kicked in, and he approached cautiously. The fungi's glow wasn't just for show. It was likely a warning. He pulled a small fragment of moss from the ground and brushed it against one of the caps. The fungi hissed, releasing a puff of spores into the air. Ezra backed away quickly, covering his mouth and nose. Toxic, then. Useful, if he could figure out how to weaponize it. And before he could investigate further, the ground beneath him trembled. A low, guttural roar echoed through the cavern, followed by another and another. Ezra froze, his heart pounding. The sound came from deeper within the cavern, from the same direction as the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Multiple roars, multiple dragons, multiple scratches, multiple thoughts. Ezra's mind raced. He'd barely survived one of these creatures, and only because he'd noticed its vulnerability. If there were more, he didn't finish the thought. Instead, he turned his attention back to the environment. The cavern wasn't just a battleground, it was a resource. He had to treat it like any other hostile ecosystem. Adaptation was key. Moving quickly but carefully, Ezra began to gather what he could. The crystalline shards that littered the ground were sharp and durable, perfect for fashioning makeshift weapons. He collected several, tying them together with strips of fabric torn from his shirt. It wasn't elegant, but it would do. Next, he turned his attention to the fungi. He used another piece of fabric to carefully bundle a few of the glowing caps, ensuring he didn't come into direct contact with them. The spores could be a potent weapon if he found the right way to deploy them. Up to this point, nothing had gone smoothly in their relationship. Max had to admire, however, the Sampsons had managed to hold fast to their conspiracy theories. As he worked, the roars grew louder. Ezra's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to focus. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. "You've got this," he muttered to himself, one step at a time. The first dragon appeared moments later, its massive form emerging from the shadows like a living nightmare. This one was different from the first. Its scales were a deep crimson, and its eyes glowed with a golden hue. Smoke curled from its nostrils as it sniffed the air, its gaze locking onto Ezra. It roared, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the cavern. Ezra gripped his makeshift weapons tightly, his mind racing. He couldn't take this creature head-on. He needed to outthink it. The dragon lunged, its claws tearing through the air. Ezra dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. He scrambled to his feet, moving toward the bioluminescent fungi. The dragon followed, its massive body crashing through the cavern's terrain. Ezra reached the fungi and grabbed one of the bundled caps. With a quick motion, he hurled it at the dragon's face. The cap exploded on impact, releasing a cloud of glowing spores. The dragon roared in pain and confusion, shaking its head violently. Ezra didn't wait to see the full effect. He sprinted toward the crystalline formations, using them as cover. The dragon's thrashing grew more frantic, its movements erratic. The spores were working, disorienting the creature. Ezra seized the opportunity. He climbed onto one of the rock formations, positioning himself above the dragon. With a sharp cry, he hurled one of his crystal-tipped spears at the beast's vulnerable throat. The weapon struck true, piercing the softer scales. The dragon let out a final, agonized roar before collapsing to the ground. Ezra didn't celebrate. There wasn't time. Another roar echoed through the cavern, followed by the heavy thud of approaching footsteps. He turned to face the new threat, his body tense. This dragon was larger than the first two, its scales a brilliant sapphire that shimmered in the bioluminescent light. It moved with a deliberate, almost regal grace, its golden eyes scanning the cavern. Ezra knew immediately that this one was different. Smarter, more dangerous, and lethal. The dragon stopped a few paces away, its gaze fixed on Ezra. It didn't attack immediately. Instead, it seemed to study him, as if weighing its options. Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a beast, it was a predator that understood strategy. Ezra tightened his grip on his remaining weapons. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, meeting the dragon's gaze. His arms were pressed round his waist, and he was armed with a source of power he could leverage against any. "Come on," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Let's see what you've got." Oh! The dragon's lips curled back, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It roared, the sound deafening. Ezra braced himself, ready for the fight of his life. The cavern became a battlefield once more, the human and the dragon locked in a deadly dance of survival. Above them, the alien observers watched in silence, their experiment unfolding exactly as they had planned. The aftermath of the battle left Ezra shaken but resolute. His heart thundered in his chest, his breath shallow and ragged. The cavern floor, still damp and uneven, bore the marks of his struggle, the gouges where claws had struck rock, the scattered remnants of bioluminescent fungi, and the prone forms of two dragons. Their massive bodies were both terrifying and fascinating, even in death, and Ezra's scientist mind screamed at him to examine them, to learn everything he could, but there was no time for such indulgences. The last dragon, the intelligent one with the sapphire scales, was still out there, watching. Ezra could feel it. Above him, the translucent ceiling pulsed again, a rhythmic glow that seemed almost mocking. The aliens were undoubtedly pleased. Ezra clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. If their goal was to push him to his limits, they'd miscalculated. Ezra hadn't reached his limits yet, not even close. His eyes darted to the corpses of the fallen dragons. Their scales might provide protection. Their claws could be fashioned into weapons, and their blood, well, who knew what properties it might have? Ezra had spent years cataloging the bizarre biology of alien creatures, and he wasn't about to stop now. He approached the crimson-scaled dragon first, its body still warm. The beast's throat had been pierced by his makeshift spear, a testament to his quick thinking and sheer determination. Ezra knelt beside it, careful not to touch the toxic spores still clinging to its face. Using a sharp shard of crystal, he prized loose one of its claws, the keratin-like material surprisingly lightweight for its size. "Sorry, big guy," he muttered, working quickly, "but you're not going to need this anymore." The dragon's hide was tougher than anything he'd encountered before. It took several minutes to carve away a section of scales, each one gleaming like polished gemstones. Ezra fashioned them into crude armor, strapping them to his chest and forearms with strips of fabric from his shirt. The result wasn't pretty, but it was functional. He repeated the process with the obsidian-scaled dragon, harvesting what he could. The work was grueling, and his injuries protested with every movement, but he pressed on. He didn't have the luxury of rest. When he finished, he stood and assessed his handiwork. His armor was patchwork at best, but it would offer some protection against claws and teeth. He'd fashioned a pair of makeshift weapons, a spear tipped with a jagged dragon claw and a smaller dagger carved from a shard of sapphire-colored scale. They weren't perfect, but they were better than nothing. A low growl echoed through the cavern, snapping Ezra back to the present. He spun around, his makeshift spear at the ready. The sapphire-scaled dragon stepped into the light, its golden eyes fixed on him. Unlike the others, it didn't roar or charge. It moved with deliberate precision, its head low and its wings half unfurled. "So you're the smart one," Ezra muttered, his voice tinged with both fear and admiration. The dragon didn't respond, of course, but its gaze seemed almost curious. Ezra took a cautious step back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a test of wits. The dragon was sizing him up, waiting for him to make the first move. Ezra didn't oblige. Instead, he shifted his stance, keeping his spear between himself and the creature. His eyes flicked to the environment, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. The cavern was a maze of jagged rocks, glowing fungi, and crystal formations. If he could lure the dragon into a trap. The dragon moved first. It lunged with surprising speed, its jaws snapping shut inches from Ezra's face. He dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. The beast's tail whipped around, forcing him to duck. Ezra countered with a quick jab of his spear, aiming for the dragon's throat. The weapon glanced off its scales, leaving only a shallow scratch. The dragon recoiled, its golden eyes narrowing. It growled low, the sound vibrating through Ezra's chest. He tightened his grip on the spear, his mind racing. The creature's movements were calculated, almost surgical. It wasn't just a predator, it was a tactician. "Fine," Ezra muttered, backing away toward a cluster of glowing fungi. "Let's see how smart you really are." He reached the fungi and grabbed one of the toxic caps, careful not to inhale the spores. The dragon hesitated, its gaze flicking to the glowing plant. It sniffed the air, then snarled. Ezra hurled the cap at the creature's face, but this time the dragon was ready. It swatted the projectile aside with a flick of its claw, the spores dispersing harmlessly into the air. "Well, that's not ideal," Ezra muttered, retreating further into the cavern. Davis glanced around again. The dragon pursued, its movements fluid and unrelenting. Ezra led it through the maze of rock formations, ducking and weaving to avoid its attacks. He was faster, but not by much. The beast's claws raked the stone inches from his back, sending shards of rock flying. He couldn't keep this up forever. As he ran, an idea began to form. The dragon's intelligence was its greatest strength, but it could also be a weakness. If he could trick it into making a mistake, if he could carve out a second or two of extra brain space, he could push the deception pharaoh further into suspecting he was being fooled. He spotted a narrow crevice in the cavern wall, just wide enough for a human to squeeze through. It was a gamble, but it was his best shot. Ezra sprinted toward the crevice, the dragon hot on his heels. At the last moment, he dove into the gap, twisting his body to fit through the narrow space. The dragon slammed into the wall behind him, its roar echoing through the cavern. Ezra didn't stop. He crawled deeper into the crevice, the tight space forcing him to abandon his spear. The dragon's claws scraped against the rock, trying to reach him, but the gap was too small. For the moment, he was safe. Breathing heavily, Ezra paused to assess his surroundings. The crevice opened into a smaller chamber, its walls lined with strange glowing crystals. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, carved from the same translucent material as the cavern ceiling. Resting atop it was a small, pulsating orb. Ezra approached cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to be careful. The orb emitted a faint hum, its surface shifting and shimmering like liquid light. He reached out, then hesitated. Whatever this was, it had to be important. The aliens wouldn't have put it here otherwise. Behind him, the dragon roared again, its frustration palpable. The sound jolted Ezra into action. He grabbed the orb, its surface cool and strangely weightless in his hands. The moment he touched it, the cavern shuddered. A wave of energy pulsed outward, washing over him like a tidal wave. For a brief moment, he felt connected. To the cavern, to the dragons, to the aliens watching from above. It was as if the orb had unlocked something deep within him. The dragon's roars grew distant, its presence fading like a bad dream. Ezra blinked, disoriented, and found himself standing in the center of the cavern once more. The dragons were gone, their massive bodies replaced by empty air. The translucent ceiling above him pulsed with a frantic rhythm, the alien observers clearly agitated. Ezra looked down at the orb in his hands, its light dimming slightly. He didn't know what it was or why it had chosen him, but one thing was clear: the rules of the game had just changed. "Your move," he muttered, glaring up at the ceiling. "Let's see how you like playing against a real monster."